He chose to live alone, deep in the forest, where the sun still felt warm and danger was easy to ignore. So why did this veteran spend weeks digging a shelter underground when there was no storm, no snow, no sign of disaster? Why did his German shepherd refuse to sleep, listening to the wind, watching the trees, as if it knew something no one else did? And when the forest was still green and peaceful, what threat was coming that forced an entire community to run toward the man they once mocked? Before we begin, I hope you're safe and doing well today. Tell us, where are you watching from? Drop your location in the comments, and if stories of courage, loyalty, and quiet heroes matter to you, don't forget to subscribe. Late summer settled gently over the pine forest, warm and golden. Sunlight filtered through tall trunks in long, calm beams, the air dry but peaceful, bird song thin and distant, as if the woods were holding their breath. David Collins had chosen this place because it was quiet enough to hear himself think. He was 47, broad-shouldered but lean from years of labor, his posture slightly forward as if the weight of the past still rested between his shoulder blades. His hair was dark brown, cut short and practical, threaded with early gray at the temples. A trimmed beard lined his jaw, rough but neat, framing a face marked by strong angles and eyes that had learned how to watch without staring. Those eyes had once scanned desert horizons for threats that never announced themselves. Now they studied trees, wind, and soil. David had come back from the Middle East nearly a decade ago with no parade and no desire for one. He worked odd jobs in the small town at the forest's edge, repairing doors, fixing warped cabinets, sanding old furniture until the grain came back to life. He spoke little, paid in cash, and never stayed long enough for anyone to ask too many questions. The war had not made him cruel. It had made him careful. Careful with words, careful with people, careful with peace. His cabin stood a short walk from a narrow dirt road, built by his own hands from salvaged timber and patience. The wood had darkened naturally over time, blending into the forest instead of fighting it. Moss crept along the lower edges, softening the corners, and the roof carried a thin green skin that made the structure feel less like a house and more like something grown. David liked that. He did not want the forest to notice him too much. Bear noticed everything. The German shepherd moved ahead of David on the narrow trail that looped around the cabin, his frame large and powerful but controlled, muscles smooth beneath a thick coat of black and tan. He was no longer young, maybe 8 or 9, the gray beginning to touch his muzzle, but his posture was alert and confident. His ears rarely lay flat. His eyes were a deep, steady brown, intelligent and observant, always measuring distance and sound. Bear did not rush. He paced. He listened. David had adopted Bear from a military working dog transition program years earlier. The dog had served overseas, too, trained for detection and patrol, then retired quietly when his handler rotated home and could not take him along. The bond between them had formed without ceremony. No commands shouted, no long speeches, just shared silence and mutual understanding. Bear trusted David to lead. David trusted Bear to notice what he could not. That trust was being tested now. The summer had gone on too long. The rain that usually cooled the forest in late July had never arrived. Needles crunched underfoot. The ground had begun to crack in thin, branching lines near the cabin's edge. David noticed it first, while, splitting wood, the way the soil pulled apart, as if stretching away from itself. He had frowned, wiped sweat from his brow, and told himself it was nothing. Dry seasons happened. Bear disagreed. On their morning walks, the dog began stopping without warning. He would lift his head, ears rigid, nose working the air with slow precision. Sometimes he turned a full circle, scanning the trees as if expecting movement. Once or twice he let out a low bark, not loud, not aggressive, but sharp enough to make David stop mid-step. When David asked what was wrong, Bear did not look back. He kept his gaze fixed on the forest. The smell came a few days later. Faint, almost nothing. David noticed it only because Bear refused to leave the shaded edge of the clearing. His body angled protectively between David and the tree line. It was a bitter scent, dry and thin, like scorched resin carried on warm air. Not smoke, not yet, but close enough to stir something old and uncomfortable in David's chest. He slept poorly that night. Dreams came in fragments, wind over sand, heat pressing down until breathing felt like work. When he woke before dawn, the forest was silent in a way that felt wrong. No birds, no insects. Bear sat upright by the door, eyes open, waiting. By mid-morning, David made a decision he could not fully explain, not even to himself. He fetched his shovel and walked the perimeter of the cabin, marking a wide circle in the dirt. Bear followed, watching intently. David began to dig. It was slow, unglamorous work. The soil resisted, dry and compacted, every thrust of the shovel sending a dull vibration up his arms. Sweat soaked his shirt. His back protested. Still, he kept going, carving a shallow trench that curved steadily around the cabin. When he reached the slope that dipped toward a small, seasonal stream, he angled the trench carefully, guiding it downhill. Bear stood at his shoulder, occasionally stepping forward to sniff the path David had chosen, then stepping back as if satisfied. David did not think of it as fortification. He thought of it as preparation. In the desert, they had learned that waiting for proof often meant waiting too long. You prepared because you could, because no one else would do it for you. The first comment came that afternoon when David drove into town for supplies. A man named Mark Reynolds noticed the dirt on his boots and the shovel in the truck bed. Mark was in his early 50s, tall and thick-set, with a booming voice and a beard he liked to stroke when he talked. He built decks and fences, considered himself practical, and enjoyed being heard. He laughed when David mentioned the trench, said it was a waste of effort, said the forest had survived worse summers, said worrying under blue skies was no way to live. A few others nodded along. David listened, expression neutral, hands steady as he counted out cash at the counter. He did not argue. He had learned long ago that certainty made people deaf. On the drive back, Bear sat upright in the passenger seat, gaze fixed on the road ahead. When they reached the cabin, the dog leapt out and immediately began circling the trench, sniffing along its edges. He paused at the lowest point, then looked up at David, tail still, eyes intent. David felt the familiar tightening in his chest. Not fear, not panic, responsibility. As the sun dipped behind the trees, casting long shadows across the clearing, David stood at the edge of the trench and looked out over the forest. It was still beautiful, still green, still calm. But calm had fooled him before. He rested his hand on Bear's head, fingers sinking into warm fur, and listened to the quiet that felt too deep to trust. Whatever was coming, Bear already knew. And David, whether the town laughed or not, intended to be ready. The festival arrived the way summer always did in the town, loud and cheerful, spilling music and laughter into the streets as if joy itself could hold the season in place. Colorful banners stretched between lampposts. Children ran barefoot with sticky hands and flushed faces. Food trucks lined the square, and the smell of grilled meat and sugar drifted outward, even reaching the first rows of trees at the forest's edge. David Collins did not go. He heard the distant echo of it from his cabin, a faint thrum carried on warm air, but he stayed where he was. The sun sat high and bright above the pines, casting confident light, the kind that made people believe nothing bad could happen today. David had learned to distrust days like that. He moved slowly around the cabin, shirt darkened with sweat, hauling metal barrels into place beneath makeshift gutters he had built from salvaged tin. Each barrel was old and dented, their blue paint faded to gray, but they held water well. He tested each seam carefully, tightening bolts, adjusting angles so not a drop would be wasted. Bear followed him in silence, pacing the perimeter, nose low, ears turning independently, as if tracking different sounds at once. The dog's coat shone in the sun, black along his back absorbing heat, tan legs dusted with forest soil. He no longer wandered far. He stayed close, always positioning himself between David and the deeper woods. When David paused to wipe his hands on his jeans, Bear lifted his head sharply and stared toward the east, where the forest thickened and the land dipped out of sight. David noticed. "What is it?" he asked quietly, though he did not expect an answer. Bear did not bark. He moved instead, slow and deliberate, leading David toward a stand of young pines not far from the cabin. Halfway there, Bear stopped and sniffed the base of a fallen tree. The bark was darkened, sticky with sap. David crouched and placed his fingers against it. The wood was warm. Too warm. There was a faint smell again, sharper than before, like scorched resin and dry needles. David straightened, his jaw tightening. He scanned the treetops. Nothing. No smoke, no haze, just green and gold and the illusion of safety. They moved back toward the cabin, and David resumed his work. He dug shallow pits along the downhill side of the clearing, lining them with stone to hold moisture in the soil. He cleared fallen needles and branches, raking the ground until bare earth showed in long arcs around the structure. Each motion was measured, controlled. This was not panic. This was habit. Preparation had kept him alive once. It might do so again. By late afternoon, a truck rolled slowly up the dirt road and stopped near the edge of the clearing. David recognized it before the door even opened. Mark Reynolds stepped out, wiping his hands on his jeans. He wore a sleeveless shirt that showed thick forearms and a sunburned neck, his beard fuller than before, streaked with gray. He smiled broadly, the kind of smile meant to disarm, not invite. "Whole town celebrating," Mark called. "Figured I'd see what you were up to out here. Looks like you're building a moat." David stood upright, resting his hands on the shovel handle. "Just keeping things tidy." Mark chuckled, glancing at the barrels, the cleared ground, the shallow trenches. "You always were a quiet one. Guess that never changed. Sun's shining, forest is green, fires happen every year somewhere else. You worry too much." David met his gaze, calm but firm. Somewhere else is still somewhere. Mark shrugged, his tone light but edged with something sharper. "Suit yourself. Town could use your help more than your holes in the ground." Bear stepped forward then, not aggressively, but enough to close the distance. He stood tall, head level, eyes steady on Mark. Mark paused, instinctively stepping back half a pace. "That dog of yours gives people the wrong idea," Mark muttered, though his voice had lost its confidence. "He gives me the right one," David replied. Mark left soon after, dust rising behind his truck. David watched until the road disappeared again, then exhaled slowly. Bear sat beside him, gaze still fixed where Mark had been, as if measuring what kind of trouble lingered after people left. As evening approached, the air shifted. The warmth remained, but something underneath it changed. The breeze picked up, dry and restless, pushing through the trees with a whispering sound that made the forest seem alert. Bear paced more quickly now, stopping often to test the wind, tail low but steady. David climbed onto the cabin's small porch and scanned the horizon. That was when he saw it. A thin column of gray, barely visible, rising far beyond the hills to the south. It was faint enough that anyone not looking for it might miss it. David did not miss it. His phone buzzed an hour later with a short alert from the county service. Small brush fire reported. Contained. No threat to structures. David read the message twice, then set the phone down. Contained did not mean gone. Night fell slowly. The festival lights glowed faintly in the distance, a soft halo beyond the trees. Music drifted in fragments. Laughter carried. The world, it seemed, had decided to celebrate anyway. David ate a simple dinner, barely tasting it, and checked the barrels one last time. He filled a bucket and dampened the ground nearest the cabin. Bear watched closely, moving only when David moved. When darkness settled fully, Bear refused to lie down. He stood near the edge of the clearing, body angled into the wind, ears twitching constantly. David tried to coax him inside, but Bear only looked back once, eyes bright in the low light, then returned his attention to the trees. David sighed and brought out a chair, sitting beside the door with a mug of water that had long gone cold. Hours passed. Sometime after midnight, the wind shifted. Bear reacted instantly, turning toward the southeast and letting out a low, urgent bark. David stood, heart pounding, and stared into the dark. The smell came again, stronger now. Smoke, real smoke, still distant but no longer faint. Sirens wailed far away, muted by distance. David imagined the town square emptying, laughter dissolving into confusion. He imagined Mark's confident smile fading. Bear did not imagine. He knew. David moved quickly, securing tools, checking water, walking the cleared perimeter one last time. Bear stayed close, never in the way, always watching the forest as if it were an enemy with many faces. When dawn finally came, the sun rose red through a thin veil of haze. The forest was still standing. The cabin was still untouched. The fire, they would later say, had been stopped miles away. An accident. A close call. David did not feel relieved. He stood beside Bear, hand resting on the dog's shoulder, and watched the light cut through smoke far, off on the horizon. The forest had spoken, quietly, briefly, and Bear had listened. Next time, David thought, it might not stop where they told it to. And next time, being ready would not be optional. The days that followed the small fire were bright, almost offensively so. The sky stayed clear, washed in pale blue from dawn to dusk, as if the land itself wanted to pretend nothing had happened. The forest looked unchanged at a distance, green crowns swaying gently in the afternoon breeze. But David Collins felt the difference the moment he stepped outside each morning. The air was thinner, drier. The ground beneath his boots no longer gave back the way it used to. It held stiff and reluctant, like something bracing for impact. Bear sensed it even more sharply. The German shepherd no longer wandered the perimeter with idle curiosity. He moved with intent, stopping often to press his nose to the earth, to patches of grass that still held color while everything else dulled. His pace slowed near shaded slopes, places where the soil remained cool beneath the surface. When David followed, Bear looked back, eyes steady, then continued forward, confident in his choice. David trusted that confidence more than the weather reports. In town, confidence was something else entirely. It began quietly, the way exclusion often does. A canceled job, then another. A woman who usually waved now looked away. A man who once asked David to repair a porch suddenly said he would handle it himself. David did not ask why. He already knew. Rumors traveled faster than smoke. They said he was unstable, that the dog was dangerous, that the veteran who lived in the trees was seeing threats where there were none. Mark Reynolds made sure of that. Mark had always enjoyed an audience, but now he had one that listened. He stood outside the hardware store one afternoon, leaning against a stack of lumber, his thick arms crossed, beard catching the light as he spoke. He told people David was digging trenches like a man expecting war. He said Bear was unpredictable, a trained animal that might snap. He laughed when he said it, but the laughter stuck. By the end of the week, David's phone stopped ringing. The loss of work was not dramatic. There was no confrontation, no slammed doors, just absence. David sat at his kitchen table one evening, tools laid out in front of him, counting what little cash he had left. The numbers did not frighten him. Hunger never had, but isolation did. Not the quiet kind he chose, but the kind imposed without asking. Bear lay at his feet, head resting on crossed paws, eyes open. When David's breathing changed, Bear lifted his head and nudged David's knee gently, a reminder that he was not alone. The stream behind the cabin began to thin. It was gradual at first. The waterline dropped an inch, then another. Rocks that had been hidden all spring now sat exposed, their surfaces chalky and dry. David knelt and dipped his fingers in the flow. The water was still cold, but it moved more slowly, as if tired. He straightened, looking upstream, and felt the old calculation begin in his mind. Distance, depth, time. That night, he made his decision. He spread a rough sketch across the table, drawn in pencil on the back of an old invoice. It was not pretty, but it was precise. A space beneath the ground, offset from the cabin's foundation, deep enough to stay cool even when the surface baked. Walls reinforced with timber and stone. A gravel bed to draw moisture down and away. Ventilation angled to pull in clean air and push smoke out if the worst came. This was not a bunker. It was a refuge. David knew what heat could do to people. He had seen men drop in places where the sun felt close enough to touch. He had seen smoke turn calm into panic in seconds. This shelter was not about hiding. It was about surviving long enough to help others do the same. Bear approved immediately. The next morning, David walked the land behind the cabin, scanning for the spot that felt right. Bear ranged ahead, moving with purpose now, stopping only to test the ground. When he reached a shallow dip near a cluster of firs. He paused. The grass there was greener, thicker. The soil beneath was cool when David pressed his palm against it. Bear sat and looked back, tail still. David exhaled slowly. "Here," he murmured. Digging began under a sky so blue it felt mocking. The earth resisted at first, compacted and dry, each shovel full a battle. David's hands blistered, then hardened. Sweat soaked through his shirt and dried again in the heat. He worked in steady rhythm, breaking only to drink sparingly and check the stream's flow. Bear stayed close, lying in the shade when he could, rising instantly if David faltered. On the second afternoon, a car approached slowly on the dirt road. David recognized the sound before he saw it. A white sedan, dusty, its paint dulled by years of sun. It stopped at the edge of the clearing, and a woman stepped out. Her name was Sarah Miller. Sarah was in her mid-30s, tall and slender, with sun-browned skin that spoke of long days outdoors. Her hair was a light brown, pulled back into a loose braid that brushed the center of her back, wisps escaping around her face. She wore a faded blue shirt with the sleeves rolled up and jeans marked by dirt at the knees. There was a tiredness in her posture, but also a quiet resolve, the kind built by responsibility rather than ambition. She held a metal water bottle in one hand and kept the other visible at her side when Bear rose to his feet. "I'm not here to cause trouble," she said gently. Her voice was calm, steady. "I brought water." David straightened, wiping his hands on his pants. He nodded once. Bear watched Sarah closely, then stepped back, accepting her presence. Sarah explained that she lived farther down the road with her young son, a boy with asthma that flared whenever the air grew thick. She had heard the talk in town. She did not believe most of it. She had seen the smoke the night of the fire, smelled it herself. She had watched Bear that morning, standing alert on the hill like a sentinel. "You're preparing," she said, glancing at the growing pit. "Everyone else is pretending." David did not argue. Sarah stayed only a few minutes, setting the water down and offering a small, grateful smile. "If you need help," she said, "you won't get it from town, but you might get it from me." When she left, Bear followed her path with his eyes until the car disappeared. Then he turned back to the pit and barked once, short and firm. Work continued. By the end of the week, the pit was deep enough that the air inside felt different, cooler, quieter. David stood at the bottom one evening, hands on his hips, listening to the muffled sounds of the forest above. This was right. He felt it in his bones. Above him, Bear paced the rim, nose testing the wind. He stopped suddenly, ears snapping forward, body stiff. David looked up. Smoke drifted faintly between the trees again, distant but undeniable. The forest was still green, the sky was still blue, and David Collins, isolated and dismissed, was no longer waiting. He was building. The heat settled into the forest like a living thing. Not loud, not dramatic, just constant. It pressed down through the canopy, seeped into the soil, and stayed there long after the sun slipped behind the trees. By the fourth day of digging, David Collins no longer measured time by hours. He measured it by shovelfuls of earth, by how often he had to stop and steady himself, by the way his hands shook when he reached for the canteen. The ground fought him at every turn. The deeper he went, the harder the soil became, packed tight by years of roots and stones. Each strike of the shovel sent a dull vibration up his arms. His palms split open despite the gloves. thin lines of blood darkening the leather before drying almost instantly in the heat. Sweat ran down his spine, soaked his shirt, then vanished, stolen by the air before it could cool him. David told himself it was fine. He had pushed through worse. But the forest did not care what he told himself. By midday, his vision began to narrow at the edges. The sounds around him softened, as if someone had wrapped the world in cloth. He leaned on the shovel, breathing harder than he should have been, heart thudding against his ribs in a way that felt wrong. He straightened too quickly, and the ground tilted. Bear reacted before David could think. The German shepherd lunged forward, teeth gripping the back of David's shirt, pulling him away from the pit. David stumbled, dropped the shovel, and sank heavily to his knees beneath the nearest patch of shade. Bear pressed close immediately, broad body blocking the sun, his fur hot to the touch, but solid and real. David tried to wave him off. The motion was weak, clumsy. Bear ignored it. The dog lowered himself, placing his head firmly against David's chest, just below the collarbone. His breathing was slow and deliberate, deep enough to be felt through bone. He stayed there, unmoving, eyes locked on David's face. Every instinct in him was focused on one task: keep him here, keep him breathing. David closed his eyes. The rhythm helped. It always had. In places far hotter than this forest, in moments far more dangerous, he had learned to anchor himself to simple things. Breath in, breath out, weight, presence. Bear was in all of that now. After a long minute, then another, the dizziness eased. The roar in his ears faded to a manageable hum. "You're right," David murmured hoarsely, one hand finding the thick fur at Bear's neck. Too far. Bear did not move until David's breathing matched his own. They stayed like that longer than necessary. David lying back against the tree roots, Bear draped across him like a living barrier between man and sun. Above them, the forest rustled softly, unaware of how close it had come to taking something it would never give back. When David finally sat up, his limbs felt heavy, uncooperative. He forced himself to drink, small, careful sips, though the water was already warm. The stream behind the cabin had dropped again. He could hear it now, the reduced flow, a faint trickle instead of the steady murmur he remembered. Fear crept in then. Quiet, insistent. Not fear of dying, fear of failing. He looked at the pit he had carved into the earth. It was still shallow, still incomplete. Smoke would not wait for him to be ready. Heat would not pause because his body had limits. For the first time since he began digging, David wondered if he was asking too much of himself, if isolation had made him reckless, if the town was right. Bear rose and nudged his shoulder firmly, a low sound rumbling in his chest. Not concern this time. Encouragement. David let out a breath that was almost a laugh. "All right," he said quietly. "We go slower." The sound of tires on dirt reached them not long after. Bear's head snapped up, ears sharp, posture alert. David shaded his eyes and saw a familiar shape pulling into the clearing. The same white sedan, dust streaked along the sides. Sarah Miller stepped out again, this time carrying 2 large containers of water and a canvas bag slung over her shoulder. She moved with purpose, long strides eating the distance between her and the cabin. When she saw David seated on the ground, her expression tightened, but she did not panic. She had the look of someone used to managing emergencies without theatrics. "You don't look great," she said plainly. David nodded once. Heat. Sarah set the water down immediately, crouching beside him. Up close, David noticed the fine lines around her eyes, the kind etched by worry rather than age. There was a faint sheen of sweat on her brow, her braid damp against her neck. She smelled faintly of soap and dust. "I figured," she said. "It's worse lower down. The air's already getting thick some afternoons." Bear sniffed her carefully, then stepped aside, allowing her closer. She glanced at him, appreciation flickering across her face. "He knew," she said. "Didn't he?" David followed her gaze to Bear. "He always does." Sarah handed him a container. "Drink. Slowly." He obeyed. They sat there for a moment, the three of them in the shade, the unfinished pit looming nearby. Sarah's eyes kept drifting back to it, to the lines David had carved into the land. "My son," she said after a while. "Evan. He's 8, small for his age. Dark hair, always wheezing when the air changes." Her mouth tightened. "The doctor says smoke would be bad, really bad." David listened without interrupting. "When that fire started last week," she continued, "he panicked before I even smelled it. Said the air felt wrong. I laughed it off. Told him it was fine." She shook her head. "I won't do that again." David looked at the pit, then back at her. "This isn't finished," he said, "and it won't help everyone." Sarah met his eyes. "It doesn't have to help everyone," she replied. "It just has, to help someone. Sometimes that's enough to start." The words settled heavily in David's chest. Until that moment, every calculation he had made was personal. How long he and Bear could last, how much water they could store, how to keep themselves alive if the forest turned. He had told himself that was practical, necessary. But listening to Sarah speak about her son, seeing the quiet fear she carried so carefully, something shifted. He was no longer digging just for survival. He was digging for time. Time for people to get out. Time to breathe. Time to not panic when the sky turned dark and the air burned. Bear moved closer to Sarah then, lowering his head until it rested briefly against her knee. She startled, then relaxed, fingers sinking into his fur without thinking. "He's gentle," she said softly. "They're wrong about him." David's jaw tightened. "They're wrong about a lot of things." Sarah stood after a moment, brushing dirt from her jeans. "I can't stay long. Evan's waiting, but I'll be back." She hesitated, then added, "And I won't be the only one. Not forever." She left the water and the bag, which held electrolyte packets and bandages. Practical things. Useful things. After she drove away, David remained seated for a long time. Bear lay beside him, panting lightly, tongue lolling as he watched the tree line. The forest looked the same as it had that morning. Green, calm, safe. But David knew better now. He had felt the edge, the way the body faltered before the mind admitted danger. He reached out and rested his hand on Bear's broad back. "This isn't just ours anymore," he said quietly. Bear's tail thumped once against the dirt. They returned to work later that afternoon, slower and more deliberate. David reinforced the sides he had already dug, stacking stones to prevent collapse. He paced himself, drank often, listened when his body protested. Bear never left the shade for long, always positioning himself where David could see him. As the sun dipped low and the forest cooled slightly, David stepped back and looked at what they had done. It was not impressive, not yet, but it was enough to believe in. That night, as David lay on the cabin floor with the windows open, Bear stretched out beside him, one paw resting lightly against his leg. David stared at the ceiling, listening to the distant crackle of the forest settling into darkness. For the first time since the town turned away, he did not feel alone. He felt responsible, and that somehow felt stronger. The wind changed without ceremony. There was no thunder, no warning siren, no darkening sky to announce the shift. One moment the air drifted lazily through the trees, warm but familiar, and the next it pressed forward with a dry insistence that made the leaves turn their undersides to the light. David Collins noticed it first in his throat, a faint irritation that made him clear it twice. Bear noticed it in the way his ears snapped forward and stayed there, rigid, as if listening to something too distant for human senses. The forest still looked harmless. Sunlight poured through the canopy in long golden shafts. Birds moved from branch to branch. The sky was a flawless blue, the kind of day people photographed and called perfect. That was what made it dangerous. Fire did not need drama. It needed fuel and wind. This forest had both. The smell arrived next, thin at first, almost polite, a whisper of bitterness beneath the resin and warm soil. David paused mid-step, hand on a bucket he had been carrying toward the stream. He inhaled again, slower this time, letting the air settle. There it was, smoke, diluted but unmistakable. Bear growled low in his chest, not the warning growl he used for strangers. This was something else, urgent, commanding. David dropped the bucket and turned toward the ridge. From that angle he could see a faint haze hanging above the distant hills, barely visible against the brightness. It did not look like much. It never did at first. But the wind pushed again, harder now, carrying with it the scent of burning brush and something sharper, the smell of pitch igniting. The fire had found dry ground. David moved quickly but not blindly. He had rehearsed this moment in his head more times than he cared to admit. He went through the checklist automatically. Water containers near the entrance, tools stacked where he could reach them. The trapdoor not yet installed, but the opening reinforced and ready. He reached for the radio he kept by the window and turned the dial. Static answered him. He tried again. A voice crackled briefly, then vanished beneath interference. The road would be the next problem. Bear ran ahead toward the tree line, then stopped, barking sharply and turning back. David followed and saw what the dog had already understood. The narrow forest road was choked with dust and drifting ash now, visibility reduced to a few dozen yards. Somewhere beyond that curve, branches snapped. The fire was not on the road yet, but the wind was feeding it straight toward the valley. A truck appeared through the haze, headlights on despite the daylight. It slowed as it approached, then stopped abruptly. A man stepped out, tall and lean, wearing a ranger's uniform faded by sun and use. His hair was dark and cropped short, his face lined with exhaustion that spoke of too many long days in a season that had started too early. His name was Lucas Grant. Lucas moved with practiced efficiency, eyes scanning the trees, the wind, the slope of the land. When he saw the haze above the hills, his jaw tightened. He looked at David and Bear, then back at the road. "It jumped the creek," he said, voice calm but strained. "Wind shifted an hour ago. We're trying to hold it back, but access is bad. Engines can't get up here yet." David nodded once. "How long?" Lucas hesitated. That told David more than any number could. "If the wind keeps pushing like this," Lucas said carefully, "you don't have long." Bear barked again, louder this time. then ran toward the excavation behind the cabin. He stopped at the edge and turned, eyes fixed on David. His posture was different now. No hesitation, no question. This was not a suggestion. David felt it settle into him like a weight and a relief at the same time. The decision he had been delaying was no longer his to make. "We open it," he said. Lucas frowned. "Open what?" David did not explain. There was no time. He moved with Bear at his side, pulling back the temporary cover and clearing the entrance. The air that rose from below was cooler, denser, a pocket of calm beneath the growing chaos above. Ash began to fall in earnest now, fine gray flakes drifting down like snow that burned. The fire announced itself then, not with flames, but with sound. A distant roar, low and continuous, like an ocean rolling over rock. The forest responded with its own noises. Trees creaked, branches snapped, birds erupted from the canopy in frantic bursts. Lucas stared at the opening, then at David. "You built a shelter," he said, not a question. "A place to breathe," David replied. Another gust slammed into the clearing, sending sparks dancing through the undergrowth. Bear barked again and placed himself at the entrance, standing tall, blocking the heat with his body as if daring it to come closer. David moved faster now, hauling containers down, stacking them where he had planned. His hands shook, but his mind was clear. This was the moment everything led to. He heard footsteps behind him and turned to see Sarah Miller running toward the cabin, her braid loose now, face flushed with exertion and fear. She clutched her son Evan close, the boy's small chest already rising too fast, his breaths shallow and uneven. Sarah's eyes locked on David. "The road's blocked," she said, voice tight. "I saw the smoke and I ran." David pointed without hesitation. "Down, slowly. Keep him low." Bear shifted instantly, stepping aside to make room, then lowering himself as Evan passed, his presence steady and reassuring. The boy reached out without thinking, fingers tangling briefly in Bear's fur, grounding himself. More shapes emerged from the haze. A middle-aged couple, faces streaked with ash. A man carrying a crate with a frightened cat inside, the animal's green eyes wide, fur mottled gray and white, claws hooked through the plastic grid. The cat's name was Milo, though David would not learn that until later. For now, it was just another living thing that needed air. Lucas helped guide them, his ranger training cutting through the panic. "One at a time," he said firmly. "Follow the dog." That was all it took. People listened. The heat intensified rapidly. Flames crowned the ridge beyond the clearing, not yet close enough to scorch, but close enough to radiate. The sky remained blue overhead, cruel in its calm. Smoke thickened, turning sunlight into a dull amber haze. Bear stood at the entrance, barking in short, sharp bursts, ushering people down. Each bark carried authority. Each pause allowed another to pass. When the last person reached the bottom, Bear remained above for a moment longer, eyes fixed on the tree line, gauging distance and wind with an instinct no training could replicate. David called his name once. Bear turned and descended, taking his place at David's side. They sealed the entrance just as the first embers reached the clearing. Inside, the shelter held. The air stayed cool, filtered, moving gently through the vents David had angled and reinforced. Evan's breathing slowed gradually, Sarah's hand never leaving his back. The couple huddled together, whispering. The cat's crate rested against the wall, Milo's frantic cries softening as the temperature dropped. Lucas wiped soot from his face. disbelief etched into his features. "You opened this before anyone told you to," he said quietly. David shook his head. "The dog did." Bear lay down then, finally allowing himself to rest, eyes still open, chest rising steady and calm. Outside, the fire roared past, hungry and indiscriminate. Inside, people breathed. The difference between disaster and survival narrowed to a single choice made early, guided by trust. Above them, the forest burned. Below, they waited. The moment David lifted the reinforced door fully, the difference in the air became undeniable. A slow, steady breath rose from the chamber below, cool and clean, carrying the faint scent of stone and damp earth instead of ash and resin. It moved outward like reassurance, brushing against scorched skin and tight lungs alike. For a brief second, the world above and the world below seemed to exist at once, fire and safety separated by little more than planning and resolve. David did not hesitate. He swung the door wider and secured it open, then turned immediately to the hand pump mounted beside the cabin wall. It was old, rebuilt from salvaged parts, but solid. He worked it in a steady rhythm, arms burning as water surged up from the underground reserve and spilled into the shallow channels he had carved days earlier. The dry soil around the cabin darkened as it drank, the ground hissing softly as heat met moisture. Steam rose in thin white threads, lifting some of the smoke away from the structure. Above, the forest groaned. The fire had not yet reached the clearing, but it was close enough now that the sound filled the air. A continuous roar, punctuated by sharp cracks as branches ignited and collapsed. Ash fell heavier, coating everything in gray. The sky, once bright and blue, dulled into a hazy amber, the sun reduced to a pale disk. Bear stood at the edge of the clearing, body tense, tail low but steady. He did not retreat when the heat surged forward with the wind. Instead, he lifted his head and barked, a deep, commanding sound that cut through the chaos. It was not fear, it was instruction. David recognized it instantly. Bear was calling. The dog moved a few steps toward the trees, barked again, then returned to the hutch entrance, pacing in a clear pattern. Out, call, back. His eyes never left the forest line. He was measuring distance, listening for something beyond the fire itself. Then David heard it. A voice. Hoarse, strained, carried by the shifting wind. Bear's ears snapped forward, and he barked again, louder this time, then bolted toward the sound. David followed as far as he dared, stopping where the smoke thickened. Through the haze, figures emerged. Sarah Miller first, her face streaked with soot, braid half undone, one arm wrapped tightly around her son, Evan. The boy's skin was pale beneath the ash, his chest working too hard for the small body it supported. Behind them came others, an elderly man with a cane, hunched but stubborn, refusing to let go of a cloth sack he carried. A young couple, the woman clutching her belly, eyes wide and unfocused, a teenage girl holding a smaller child by the hand, her jaw set with determination far older than her years. Fear had pulled them from their homes, but hope, thin as it was, had brought them uphill. Bear reached Sarah first. He slowed, adjusted his pace to Evan's labored steps, then positioned himself on the boy's unburned side, shielding him from the worst of the heat. Evan's fingers found Bear's fur again, clutching instinctively. His breathing hitched, then eased, just a little. "Follow him," David called, voice rough but firm. "Stay low." They did. The moment they crossed the threshold, The change was immediate. Coughing softened. Eyes that had been wide with panic blinked in disbelief as the air cleared. Sarah dropped to her knees just inside the chamber, pressing Evan close, her forehead resting against his hair as she whispered reassurances she barely believed herself minutes earlier. More voices came from the smoke. Bear did not stop. Each time David sealed the door partway to manage airflow, Bear signaled again, barking sharply until David opened it once more. The dog ran out, vanished into the haze, and returned with someone else in tow. A woman with smoke-burned hands. A man carrying a crate that rattled with movement. Milo the cat pressed against the bars, fur darkened, but eyes still bright with life. A pair of boys, no older than 10, their faces identical in shock, clinging to each other as they followed Bear without question. The chamber filled slowly, carefully. David adjusted the vents as bodies increased, angling them to maintain circulation. The design held. Cool air flowed in from the lower intake, while smoke and heat were drawn upward and away. The pump continued its steady work, water feeding the earth above, buying time. Lucas Grant appeared again at the edge of the clearing, face blackened, uniform torn. He took in the scene in a single glance, eyes widening as he realized what was happening. "You're sheltering them," he said, disbelief edged with awe. David nodded. "For as long as we can." Lucas looked back toward the fire, then at the people disappearing underground. His voice dropped. "You might be the only place left." Bear returned once more, slower now, his sides heaving with exertion. He stopped in front of David, holding his gaze. This time there was no urgency in his eyes, just certainty. David closed the door carefully, sealing it against the worst of the smoke, leaving the vents to do their work. Inside, the chamber glowed softly under lantern light, faces illuminated in warm gold rather than harsh red. People sat where they could, some on the floor, some against the walls, sharing water, passing quiet words back and forth. The sound of the fire above was muffled now, distant enough to breathe around. Sarah looked up at David, eyes shining with tears that cut clean lines through the ash on her cheeks. "You saved him," she said simply. David shook his head. "He did." He nodded toward Bear. Bear had settled near the entrance, lying across it like a guardian, eyes half closed but alert. He rose only when another cough echoed too sharply, or when someone shifted too close to panic, his presence enough to steady them. The elderly man with the cane sat nearby, his breathing finally even. He watched Bear for a long moment, then spoke. "Smart dog," he said quietly. "Smart man, too." David did not answer. He focused instead on the rhythm of the pump, on the airflow, on the way Evan's chest now rose and fell at a pace that would not kill him. Hours passed like that. Above them the fire raged, then began to move on, following fuel and wind elsewhere. The heat lessened gradually. Ash still fell, but the roar softened, broken by long stretches of silence. In that silence, something else took shape. People talked, softly at first, then more openly. Names were shared, stories, where they had been when the smoke came, what they had left behind. Fear did not vanish, but it shifted, no longer sharp and isolating but shared. Bear moved among them when he could, resting his head on a knee here, nudging a trembling hand there, his calm contagious. David stood back, watching it all, a strange warmth spreading through his chest that had nothing to do with fire or weather. This place beneath, the earth had become more than a shelter. It was a gathering point, a proof of preparation over denial, of trust over mockery. When the air outside finally cleared enough to risk opening the door again, David did so slowly. Cool night air slipped in, carrying the smell of wet soil and distant smoke, but no longer choking. The fire had passed, not ended, but moved. Bear stood immediately, ears lifting, nose testing the air. He barked once, satisfied. The light beneath the earth had held, and because it had, so had they. The night settled slowly after the fire passed, not with peace, but with a fragile quiet that felt earned. Smoke still drifted in thin veils through the trees, illuminated by moonlight that looked dull and bruised. Inside the shelter, the air remained steady and clean, the vents breathing softly, as if the earth itself had learned how to care for those gathered within it. David Collins moved among the people with measured steps, offering water, checking faces, speaking in low tones that carried calm, even when words ran out. Bear stayed near the entrance, positioned where the airflow shifted. His large frame blocked what little smoke tried to creep inside, his body angled instinctively to shield the smallest first. Children leaned against him without fear, tiny arms looped around his neck or buried in the thick fur along his shoulders. He accepted the weight without complaint, eyes half closed but alert, chest rising and falling with a patience that steadied the room. David watched that and felt something tighten behind his ribs. This was no longer preparation. This was purpose in motion. Footsteps approached outside, hesitant at first, then more determined. Bear lifted his head, ears turning toward the sound, but he did not bark. He waited. David followed his gaze as a figure emerged into the lantern light just beyond the door. Mark Reynolds stood there, shoulders slumped, face streaked with ash and sweat, his once neat beard matted and uneven. He looked smaller than David remembered, the confidence that usually filled his posture replaced by something closer to humility. Behind Mark came several young men and women, faces smudged with soot, eyes wide and tired. They carried what little they had managed to save. Water jugs, first aid kits, a bundle of blankets. Their movements were careful, respectful, as if they understood they were stepping into something they had not believed in hours earlier. Mark removed his cap before he spoke. His hands shook slightly, whether from exhaustion or something deeper was hard to tell. He cleared his throat once, then met David's eyes. "I was wrong," he said. His voice was rough, stripped of the bravado it usually carried. "About you, about the dog, about all of this." The room grew quiet. David did not respond immediately. He stepped aside and gestured toward the entrance. "Come in," he said. "Stay low." Mark hesitated, glancing at Bear. The German shepherd did not move, but his gaze held Mark steady, unreadable and calm. Mark swallowed and took a step forward, then another. Bear shifted slightly to make room, his presence firm but welcoming. As Mark descended, his breath caught when he felt the cool air settle around him. He looked back once, eyes wide with disbelief, then continued down, guided by the same trust everyone else had placed in Bear. The volunteers followed, one by one. Inside, the shelter adjusted to the new weight without complaint. People made space, instinctively, scooting closer together, passing cups and cloths along. No one asked who belonged where. There were no boundaries left to defend. The fire had erased them. Mark knelt near the center of the chamber, setting down the supplies he had brought. He looked around at the faces illuminated by lantern light. Sarah Miller sat against the wall. Her tall, slender frame curved protectively around Evan, her son's breathing now even and quiet. The elderly man with the cane rested nearby, eyes closed, chest rising steadily. Milo the cat peeked from his crate, whiskers twitching as he tested the air, no longer frantic. Mark's gaze returned to David. He bowed his head. "I told people you were losing it," he said. "I said the dog was dangerous." His voice cracked slightly. "Turns out you were the only one ready." David felt the old instinct to deflect rise up, the habit of minimizing praise and pain alike. But he pushed it aside. This was not about him. "We all had choices," David said. "Some of us made them earlier." Mark nodded, accepting that without defense. "Let me help," he said quietly, "with whatever comes next." Outside, the wind shifted again, this time carrying less heat. The worst had passed, but the aftermath would linger. David knew that. The forest would smolder. Homes would be damaged. The road would take time to clear. Fear would not vanish overnight. Inside the shelter, something else began to take root. People talked openly now. Mark listened more than he spoke, distributing water, checking on the volunteers he had brought. One of them, a young woman with cropped hair and soot smudged across her cheek, sat near Bear and whispered thanks into his fur. Bear responded by leaning his weight gently against her leg, grounding her the way he had grounded David countless times before. A small boy laughed suddenly, the sound sharp and surprising in the quiet chamber. Heads turned, startled, then softened. The boy had been tracing the pattern of Bear's fur with his finger, mesmerized by the way it changed color in the lantern light. Bear flicked an ear, then wagged his tail once, slow and deliberate. David felt his throat tighten. He moved to the pump and worked it again, sending another surge of water through the channels above. The ground around the cabin would remain damp through the night, buying more safety. He moved methodically, but his mind wandered briefly, unbidden, to other shelters he had known. Tents under desert suns, concrete rooms with flickering lights, places built for survival but stripped of warmth. This place was different. Sarah rose quietly and approached David. In the softer light, her features looked gentler, though the strength remained. Her hair had escaped its braid entirely now, strands clinging to her soot-streaked cheeks. She placed a hand on David's arm, light but firm. "They're listening," she said softly. "Really listening." David glanced around. Mark speaking quietly with the elderly man, the volunteers organizing supplies, children resting against one another, against Bear. No one asked who owned the shelter. No one argued about credit or blame. The question had become irrelevant. "It belongs to whoever needs it," David said. Sarah smiled faintly. "Exactly." Hours passed like that. The shelter held steady, its design proving itself again and again. When a pocket of smoke drifted toward the entrance, Bear adjusted his position, blocking it instinctively. When someone panicked briefly, coughing hard, David knelt beside them, spoke quietly until their breathing slowed. Mark took direction without complaint, moving where needed, offering strength instead of opinion. Near dawn, the air outside cooled enough to open the door part way. Pale light crept in, revealing a forest changed but not destroyed. Blackened patches marked the ground, but green remained. Smoke lingered low, but it no longer choked. Bear stood and stretched, then returned to his post, eyes scanning the tree line one last time before settling again. A child wrapped her arms around his neck and whispered something no one else could hear. Bear responded by resting his chin briefly on her shoulder. David watched and felt something unfamiliar rise in him. Not pride, not relief, belonging. When Mark approached him again, it was without the crowd, without the need to perform. "When this is over," Mark said quietly, "people are going to ask questions. They're going to want to know how you did this." David nodded. "I'll show them." Mark extended his hand, rough and calloused, a builder's hand. David took it. The handshake was firm, honest, and final in the way apologies sometimes needed to be. As dawn brightened the entrance, the shelter felt less like a refuge and more like a foundation. Something built under pressure that would not be forgotten once the danger passed. David looked around at the gathered faces, at Bear at the center of it all, and understood something simple and profound. This place was no longer his. It never had been. Morning arrived without fanfare. No sirens, no crackling flames. Just light, pale and tentative, slipping through smoke thinned enough to breathe through. David Collins stepped outside first, Bear at his side, both of them moving carefully, as if the land itself needed gentleness after what it had endured. The clearing around the cabin looked changed, but not destroyed. The soil was dark and damp where the hand pump had done its work. Charred leaves lay scattered like fallen feathers, but beneath them, green still pushed through. The fire had been contained during the night. Farther down the ridge, faint plumes of smoke rose in controlled columns now. Not wild or hungry, but disciplined, guided by crews who had finally reached the forest roads. Engines rumbled in the distance, steady and reassuring. The worst was over. The cabin still stood. David walked its perimeter slowly, running his hand along the outer wall. The earthworks he had carved, the channels he had filled with water, the open buffer of cleared ground, had all done exactly what they were meant to do. Heat had passed, but it had not stayed. Fire had approached, but it had not taken. Bear paused near the edge of the clearing and sniffed deeply, then looked back at David. His tail wagged once, slow and satisfied. People emerged behind them, one by one, faces drawn but alive. Sarah Miller stepped out holding Evan's hand, the boy blinking in the morning light, chest rising evenly, no wheeze in his breath. She looked tired in a way that went deeper than sleep, but her posture was lighter. Her shoulders no longer pulled tight around her ears. Her sun-browned skin was streaked faintly with ash, her hair a tangled halo around her face. But when she smiled at David, it was genuine. Others followed, the elderly man with the cane, the young couple, the woman's hand still resting protectively over her stomach, the volunteers who had come with Mark Reynolds, now quieter, their energy turned inward as reality set in. Milo the cat was carried out last, peering from his crate at a world that smelled different but still existed. Mark came out slowly, blinking, eyes adjusting. He looked around the clearing, at the intact cabin, at the damp soil, at Bear standing watch like he belonged there. He exhaled a long breath he had likely been holding since the fire began. "You did this," he said, not accusing, not praising, just stating fact. David shook his head gently. "We did." Later that morning, the town gathered. Not in the usual meeting hall, which still smelled faintly of smoke, but in the open space near the edge of the forest, where people could see what had saved them. There were fewer voices raised than usual. No arguments, no blame, just listening. Lucas Grant stood near the front, uniform cleaned as best he could, soot still marking the edges of his sleeves. He spoke briefly, explaining how close the fire had come, how quickly it had moved, how different this season was from any he remembered. His words carried weight, but they were not the center of attention. David was. Not because he asked to be, but because everyone kept looking his way. When someone suggested he should lead whatever came next, David raised his hand calmly. He was tired, but steady. His beard was flecked with gray now, his face lined not just by age, but by years of holding things in that never fully left. "I'm not a leader," he said. "I'm a builder, a fixer. I see problems, and I try to solve them." There was no false humility in his voice, just truth. "What we built here," he continued, gesturing toward the ground beneath their feet, "worked because it was simple, because it respected the land instead of fighting it. Anyone here can learn it." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Not doubt, interest. Mark stepped forward then, surprising no one and everyone at once. He looked different in the daylight. Still broad-shouldered, still solid, but the sharpness had dulled. His beard was trimmed unevenly now, his eyes clearer. "He's right," Mark said. "This shouldn't belong to one man. It should belong to the town." Heads nodded. Sarah's among them. The decision came easily after that. They would build more. Not deep bunkers or concrete shelters, but small, practical chambers placed thoughtfully through the forest and along the ridges. Cool spaces, clean air. Places where people could breathe if the land turned against them again. David would teach anyone willing to learn. Lucas would help identify safe locations. Mark and the younger volunteers would do the digging. No titles were assigned. No credit claimed. Bear lay nearby in the grass. Children gathered around him without fear. One boy leaned against his side. Another traced the shape of his ears. A little girl, hair still smelling faintly of smoke, wrapped her arms around his neck and whispered something that made his tail wag slowly. Someone laughed and said, laughed. He looked like a guardian out of an old story. "The forest watcher," a child said, serious and reverent. The name stuck. Weeks passed. The forest healed in the way forests always do. Slowly, stubbornly, charred ground softened under new growth. Ash fed soil instead of choking it. Summer gave way to early autumn, leaves shifting from deep green to gold and rust. The air cooled, but it did not threaten. David returned to work, though it was different now. He repaired cabins damaged by heat, reinforced roofs, helped rebuild fences. He was paid when people could pay him, fed when they could not. No one crossed the street to avoid him anymore. No one whispered when Bear walked by at his side. One evening, David sat on the cabin steps, watching the light fade through the trees. Bear lay beside him, head resting on his paws, eyes following the movement of birds settling in for the night. The forest was quiet again. Not the uneasy quiet from before the fire, but a calm earned through understanding. Sarah stopped by with Evan, the boy chattering happily about school and the dog who saved everyone. She stayed only a moment, but before leaving, she placed a small basket beside David. Bread, apples, simple things. "We're here," she said softly, "just so you know." David nodded. He did know. When the sun dipped below the ridge and the forest took on the long shadows of fall, David felt something settle in him at last. Not relief, not triumph, acceptance. He had not returned from war to disappear. He had returned to build, to prepare, to stand quietly until needed. Bear shifted closer, pressing his warm weight against David's leg. David rested a hand on his back, fingers sinking into familiar fur. They were not on the edge anymore. They were home. This story is not really about fire or shelters or even survival. It is about what happens when one person chooses responsibility over comfort, preparation over denial, and love over fear. David never tried to prove anyone wrong. He simply acted when others looked away. And Bear, with loyalty that needed no words, reminded everyone that courage often arrives quietly, on 4 steady paws, long before danger is visible. In life, we all face moments like this, times when the sky still looks blue, yet something deep inside warns us to prepare. Times when doing the right thing feels lonely, misunderstood, even mocked. But as this story shows, what is built with faith, patience, and compassion never goes to waste. It becomes shelter not only for the body, but for the soul of a community. Perhaps this is one of the quiet miracles God places in our path. Not thunder from the heavens, but strength placed in ordinary hands. A reminder that God works through preparation, kindness, and those willing to stand firm for others. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to share it. Leave a comment and tell us where you are watching from. Subscribe to the channel so we can continue sharing stories of hope, faith, and quiet courage. And may God bless you, protect your home, and guide your steps today and always.